The gate shouldn't have been moving. Not like that. Not in air so still you could hear a whisper from the cotton fields, half a mile away. But there it was, swinging wide and wild, creaking Jonah's name with every arc, metal hinges screaming like they knew something the rest of them didn't. They found his work shirt folded neat on the gatepost, buttons still fastened, like he'd just stepped out of his own skin and walked away. The dogs couldn't pick up a trail. The river showed no tracks. And that gate, it kept swinging for 3 days straight, though every man who tried to still it found his hands wouldn't work right when he reached for it. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now let me tell you how a man who wasn't supposed to exist as anything more than property became a ghost story that white folks in Mississippi still won't talk about after dark. The Hartwell plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of Mississippi Delta soil so rich it looked almost black when you turned it over with a plow. In the autumn of 1844, cotton grew there like a promise and a curse combined. White bowls bursting open under a sun that pressed down on everything with the weight of divine judgment. The plantation house rose from a man-made hill at the property's eastern edge, its white columns visible from nearly every field, a constant reminder of who owned what and who owned whom. 47 souls lived in bondage there, their quarters arranged in 2 neat rows behind the ginning house, close enough to smell the processed cotton, but far enough that the main house residents could pretend those people weren't quite real unless work needed doing. Jonah Fields had been born on Hartwell land 28 years earlier, delivered by his mother Celia in a cabin that no longer stood, the wood having been repurposed for pig pens when the quarters were rebuilt closer to the fields in 1832. He had his mother's eyes, dark and deep set, and his father's broad shoulders, though he'd never known the man who gave him that build. His father had been sold south when Jonah was still learning to walk, traded for a breeding mare and $50 cash to a plantation somewhere in the bayou country, where men disappeared into swamp work and never came back. Celia had died of fever when Jonah was 15, and he'd stood beside her grave marker, a simple wooden cross, wondering if his father was still alive somewhere, still breaking his back under someone else's whip. By 1844, Jonah had developed a reputation as the most reliable field hand on the Hartwell place. He could plow straighter rows than any man Master Hartwell had ever owned, could judge the ripeness of cotton bolls at a glance, could shoe a horse or mend a fence or dig a drainage ditch with equal competence. He spoke little, worked steadily, and never gave the overseers reason to reach for their whips. This last quality made him valuable in a way that transcended mere labor. On a plantation, an enslaved man who caused no trouble was worth his weight in cotton futures. Master Charles Hartwell, a barrel-shaped man of 53 with a face like uncooked dough and a voice that carried across the fields like cannon fire, took particular pride in Jonah's reliability. He would point him out to visitors, other planters who came to discuss crop yields and the trouble with keeping field hands in line. "Look at that one there," Hartwell would say, gesturing toward Jonah with a tumbler of whiskey in his meaty hand. "That's Jonah, best worker I ever owned. You could set your timepiece by him. Never needs the lash. Born to it, I reckon. Some of them are just born to it." Jonah would keep his eyes on his work when the white men talked about him like he was a particularly well-bred hound. He'd learned early that the safest place for an enslaved man was in the shallow water of invisibility. present enough to avoid punishment for laziness, but not so present that you became an individual in their eyes. Individuals got sold away from family. Individuals got whipped for imagined disrespect. Individuals got hanged from the old oak by the tobacco barn when examples needed to be made. But Jonah was not what Master Hartwell believed him to be. In the privacy of his own skull, Jonah was a student of maps and mathematics, of stars and seasons, of the hundreds of small details that might mean the difference between dying in the Delta and living as a free man in a place where your children couldn't be sold away from you for gambling debts. He could read, though he was careful to never let anyone know it. His mother had taught him in secret before she died, having learned herself from a former master's daughter who'd considered it a charitable act before she understood what her father would do if he found out. Celia had paid for that charity with a whipping that left scars like rope burns across her back, but she'd already passed the knowledge to her son by then, and knowledge, once planted, grew in directions that couldn't be controlled. In the 3 years before 1844, Jonah had taught himself to recognize north by the moss on trees, by the position of stars, by the way certain birds migrated in spring. He'd learned to estimate distances by counting his steps and measuring them against the roads he occasionally traveled when sent on errands. He'd memorized the faces of every person who visited the Hartwell plantation, categorizing them by their likelihood to help a runaway or turn him in. He'd noted which dogs were kept hungry and which were fed well enough to be lazy. He'd observed that the night patrols in the county rarely ventured far from the main roads, and that the swamps to the west, while dangerous, were less patrolled than the river routes to the north. He'd also fallen in love, though that was a complication he hadn't planned for and didn't particularly want. Her name was Ruth, and she belonged to the Henderson plantation 3 miles east. Jonah had met her at a corn-shucking festival the previous autumn, one of those rare occasions when enslaved people from different plantations were allowed to gather under supervision, to work and dance, and briefly pretend they were something other than property. Ruth had a smile that made Jonah forget to be careful, forget to be invisible. She sang while she worked, voice clear and strong, and when she looked at him across the bonfire that night, he felt something in his chest crack open like a seed hull splitting. They'd found ways to see each other after that. Stolen moments when Jonah was sent on errands near Henderson land, or when Ruth was brought to the Hartwell place for large gatherings. They talked about impossible things, about a cabin of their own somewhere far away, about children who would learn to read before they learned to be afraid. Ruth wanted to go north. She'd heard about something called the Underground Railroad, about houses where white people hid runaways and moved them along safe routes toward Canada. Jonah listened, but didn't commit. Not yet. He'd seen too many failed escape attempts, too many men brought back with dogs hanging off their legs, too many women sold south as punishment for trying to run. But in the late summer of 1844, everything changed. The catalyst was a single piece of information delivered by a traveling blacksmith who worked the plantations in the county. The man was free, having purchased his liberty years earlier, and he carried news between properties like a human newspaper. On a sweltering August morning, while Jonah held a horse steady for shoeing, the blacksmith leaned close and spoke soft words that sounded like thunder in Jonah's ears. The Henderson place was in debt. Master Henderson had lost heavily on cotton speculation and was preparing to sell off assets to cover his losses. The first assets to go would be the prime-aged slaves, the ones who would bring top dollar at auction. Ruth would be sold within the month, probably to a trader who'd take her deep south to the sugar parishes where enslaved people worked themselves to death in 3 to 5 years on average. Jonah's hands had gone numb on the horse's bridle. The blacksmith kept working, his hammer ringing against the anvil in steady rhythm. He didn't look at Jonah, didn't acknowledge the information he'd just delivered. When he was done, he gathered his tools and moved on to the next job. Jonah stood there in the heat, staring at nothing, feeling the world rearrange itself around this new, terrible knowledge. That night, he walked the perimeter of the plantation, as he sometimes did when sleep wouldn't come. The Hartwell place was bordered on the north by the Yazoo River, wide and brown and full of snakes. To the east lay more plantations, an unbroken chain of cotton fields and enslaved labor stretching to the Alabama border. South was the town of Greenwood, with its courthouse and jail and eager slave catchers. But west, there was something different. West was swamp and backwater, wild country where the plantation economy hadn't quite taken hold, where poor whites and free blacks and Choctaw remnants lived in settlements that didn't appear on proper maps. The gate Jonah was approaching now stood at the western edge of the property, where a dirt road led toward the swamp country. It was a simple structure, 2 oak posts sunk deep with a cross-plank gate, hung on iron hinges that squealed when moved. During the day, the gate stayed open to allow wagons through. At night, Jonah's job was to close it and check that the livestock pens were secured. It was a task he'd performed hundreds of times without incident. But tonight, standing before that gate in the thick darkness of a moonless September evening, Jonah made a decision that had been building in him like water behind a dam. He would go west. He would find a way through the swamps and whatever lay beyond. He would work his way north, using whatever knowledge and skill he possessed. And, somehow, impossibly, he would get Ruth away from Henderson's plantation before she could be sold away to die in a sugar field. The decision terrified him. It exhilarated him. It felt both inevitable and insane. Enslaved people who ran rarely succeeded. The distances were too great, the dangers too numerous, the consequences of failure too horrific. But enslaved people who stayed were already dead in every way that mattered. And Jonah had been dying slowly since the day he was born into chains he'd never chosen. He closed the gate carefully that night, as he always did. He secured the latch. He walked back to the quarters, through darkness so complete, he navigated by memory and the feel of the path beneath his feet. He lay on his wooden bunk and stared at the ceiling planks, listening to the breathing of the other men who shared the cabin. He did not sleep. The following day was a Sunday, which meant lighter work and time for the enslaved people to tend their own small garden plots, or mend their clothing, or simply rest their bodies from the previous week's labor. Jonah used the time to walk the property again, this time mapping it in his mind with new purpose. He noted where tools were stored, where food might be accessible, where guards were posted and when they changed shifts. He observed everything with the attention of a man planning a military campaign, because that's essentially what he was doing, planning an invasion of the free world by a single soldier with no weapons and no supplies. In the afternoon, he made his way to where Ruth was visiting. The Hartwell family was hosting a dinner for several neighboring planters, and enslaved people from those properties had been brought along to serve. Ruth was among them. Jonah caught her eye across the yard and gestured subtly toward the tobacco barn, a massive structure at the southern edge of the main compound. They met there 15 minutes later, in the dim, dusty space between walls hung with drying leaves. Ruth's face showed her worry immediately. She knew him well enough by now to read danger in his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah told her about the debt, about the coming sale. He told her about his plan, such as it was. He told her he was leaving within the week, and he wanted her to come with him. They would go together or not at all, because he couldn't bear the thought of freedom if it meant she was suffering somewhere he couldn't reach. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief more than fear. She'd known about the debt too, had overheard conversations between the Henderson house servants. She'd been preparing herself for the worst, had been saying mental goodbyes to everything she'd ever known. The idea that she might escape instead, that she might have a chance at something different, was almost too large to hold in her head. "When?" she asked. "Soon," Jonah said. "I need to prepare. I need to gather supplies without anyone noticing. But soon, before they can take you to auction." They held each other there in the tobacco barn, breathing in the sweet scent of drying leaves, feeling each other's heartbeat, understanding that they were about to attempt something that would either make them free or get them killed. There was no middle ground in this world, no room for partial success. You were enslaved or you were free, alive or dead. And the distance between those states was measured in miles of hostile territory and the mercy of strangers. Over the next 3 days, Jonah prepared with the methodical care of a man who understood he would get no second chances. He stole small amounts of food, dried corn and beans and salt pork, secreting them away in a hollow tree on the western edge of the property. He fashioned a crude pack from spare burlap, sturdy enough to carry supplies but light enough to run with if necessary. He studied the patrol patterns of the county's slave catchers, noting when they were most active and where they typically concentrated their efforts. He listened to every scrap of conversation among the white men, seeking information about roads and rivers and settlements to the west. On the 3rd night after his meeting with Ruth, Jonah stood once again before the livestock gate at dusk. It was Thursday, the 12th of September, 1844. The air was thick and still, the kind of stillness that comes before storms. Though no rain was in the forecast, the sun had dropped below the tree line to the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Jonah had any attention to spare for beauty. He went through the motions of his evening routine mechanically. He checked the pig pens and found them secure. He counted the chickens into their coop. He examined the cattle in their pasture, ensuring none had strayed toward the fence line. Everything was as it should be, as it always was, as it had been every night for years. Then he approached the gate. The iron hinges were cold under his hands despite the day's heat. He swung the gate closed, lifted the wooden latch into place, tested it to ensure it would hold. Standard procedure, completed successfully. But instead of walking away, Jonah stood there with his palms pressed against the rough oak, feeling the solidity of it, the permanence, the way it marked the boundary between the controlled space of the plantation and the wilderness beyond. In that moment, Jonah understood something fundamental about the nature of gates and boundaries, and the lines men drew to separate what they owned from what they didn't. This gate had always been a symbol, not just a barrier to keep livestock from straying. It represented every constraint that had ever been placed on his life, every choice that had been made for him rather than by him, every dream he'd been forced to defer because he wasn't considered fully human by the men who claimed ownership of his labor and his body. He opened the gate again, wide, let it swing all the way back on its hinges until it stood fully ajar. Then he stepped through it, heading west, and he did not look back. The walk to the hollow tree where he'd hidden his supplies took 20 minutes. The walk from there to the agreed meeting point with Ruth, a clearing near the Henderson property line, took another hour. She was waiting for him when he arrived, a small bundle clutched in her arms, her eyes wide with fear and determination in equal measure. "Did anyone see you leave?" Jonah asked. "No," Ruth said. "The house servants were busy with evening duties. The quarters were settling in. I told the woman who shares my cabin that I was going to fetch water and would be back shortly." "She won't raise an alarm yet then," Jonah said. "That gives us a few hours before they realize you're gone." "What about you?" Ruth asked. Jonah shook his head. "They won't check on me until morning work call. By then we'll be miles into the swamp. They'll search, but the swamp is big and confusing. If we're careful, if we're quiet, we can disappear into it like smoke." They moved west through darkness, guided by Jonah's memorized maps and the dim light of stars beginning to emerge overhead. The terrain changed quickly once they left plantation land behind, the cultivated fields giving way to scrub forest and then to swamp proper. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, bird calls and insect songs, and the occasional splash of something large moving through water. Jonah led them along what seemed to be an old hunting trail, barely visible even in daylight, a narrow path of relatively solid ground, threading through standing water and cypress knees. They moved slowly, testing each step, avoiding anything that might make noise or leave clear tracks. Ruth followed close behind him, one hand gripping the back of his shirt, trusting him completely in a world that had suddenly become alien and threatening. By midnight, they had covered perhaps 5 miles. Not much, but enough to be beyond the immediate search radius. Once the alarm was raised, they found a small rise of dry ground beneath a massive live oak, its branches spreading overhead like a protective roof. Jonah allowed them to stop there, to rest briefly and eat a small portion of their supplies. Neither of them spoke. There was too much at stake for casual conversation, too much fear and too much hope tangled together in their chests. When they started moving again an hour later, Jonah heard the first dogs, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The baying carried across the swamp like a curse, announcing that the hunt had begun earlier than expected. Someone at the quarters must have noticed Ruth's absence, must have raised an alarm that brought the masters and overseers out of their beds and into the night with guns and torches and those terrible dogs that could follow a scent through water and mud and distance. Jonah grabbed Ruth's hand and pulled her forward faster. They splashed through shallow water now, not caring about the noise, knowing that speed mattered more than stealth once the dogs were loose. The trail became harder to follow in their haste, and twice they had to backtrack when they found themselves facing water too deep to ford. The dogs grew louder behind them, closer, and Jonah could hear men's voices now too, shouting instructions to each other, coordinating the search. They ran, through water that soaked them to the waist, through mud that grabbed at their legs, through hanging moss and tangled vines that seemed determined to hold them back. Ruth fell once, going down hard in a patch of shallow water, and Jonah hauled her up without breaking stride. His lungs burned. His legs screamed for rest. Behind them, the pursuit grew louder and closer with every passing minute. Then the terrain opened up before them, the swamp giving way to a wide expanse of open water, a lake, or perhaps a wide section of river, black and still in the starlight. Jonah stared at it in dismay. They couldn't swim across, not in the dark, not knowing how far it extended or what might be waiting in those depths. But they couldn't go back either, not with the dogs so close now that he could hear them crashing through the undergrowth. Ruth was breathing hard beside him, her chest heaving, her dress torn and muddy from the run. She looked at the water and then at Jonah, and he saw in her eyes that she understood. They were trapped. The plantation masters would be on them within minutes. But Jonah had not come this far to surrender now. He scanned the shoreline desperately, looking for any option, any possibility of escape. His eyes found a massive cypress tree standing in the shallows, its trunk at least 15 feet across, its roots creating a complex maze of cavities and hiding places where the water met the wood. "There," he said, pointing. "We hide there, in the roots. Get as deep into the tangle as you can and don't move no matter what you hear." They waded into the cold water, feeling their way carefully around the cypress roots. The tree's root system was indeed extensive, creating dozens of small caves and hollow spaces where water had eroded the earth away over decades or centuries. Jonah found one large enough to accommodate them both if they pressed close together. They wedged themselves into it, water up to their chests, surrounded by wood and darkness, trying to quiet their ragged breathing. The dogs arrived minutes later. Jonah could hear them splashing into the water, baying and barking with the excitement of a scent found and followed to its end. Then men's voices, sharp with anger and satisfaction. "They're here somewhere," a voice called out. Dogs got them cornered at the water. Spread out and searched the shore. They can't have gone far. Lantern light flickered across the water, creating dancing shadows that made Jonah's hiding place feel suddenly exposed and insufficient. He pressed himself and Ruth deeper into the root cavity, feeling rough bark scrape against his back. Ruth's hand found his in the darkness, gripped it tight enough to hurt. The search went on for what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes. Men walked past their hiding place multiple times. Dogs sniffed around the cypress tree, whining and pawing at the roots. Once, a lantern was held so close that Jonah could see the individual patterns of rust on its metal frame, but the root cavity remained hidden. The water and shadow and complex geometry of the cypress roots, concealing them through sheer luck and divine providence. Eventually, the searchers moved on. They searched further along the shore in both directions. They argued about whether the runaways could have swum across the open water. One voice, which Jonah recognized as belonging to the Hartwell overseer, insisted they should wait until morning to resume the search with more men and better light. "You go on back then," another voice said, rough and unfamiliar. "Me and my boys will keep at it. There's reward money for return of runaways, and I aim to collect it." The overseer argued a bit more, but eventually agreed to head back to the plantation for reinforcements. The other man, presumably a professional slave catcher, ordered his dogs to continue working the area. Jonah and Ruth remained frozen in their hiding place, not daring to even breathe deeply, while the night wore on and the search continued around them. Dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky when the slave catcher finally gave up and moved away from the cypress tree. Jonah waited another full hour after the sounds of pursuit had faded completely before he allowed himself to move. His entire body had gone numb from the cold water and the rigid position. Ruth was shaking beside him, her lips blue in the early light. They climbed carefully out of the root cavity and made their way along the shore, staying in the cover of the trees, moving parallel to the water rather than back into the swamp. Jonah's thinking was that the searchers would expect them to continue west, so perhaps the safer route was actually north along the waterway. They moved like ghosts through the morning mist, leaving minimal traces, stopping frequently to listen for signs of pursuit. By mid-morning, they found what looked like an abandoned fishing camp, a crude shelter made of cypress planks, with a small dock extending into the water. The place had clearly not been used in months. Spiders had woven webs across the doorway. Leaves had accumulated on the floor inside, but it was dry and hidden from casual view, and Jonah decided they needed to rest there for a few hours before continuing. They were both exhausted, their bodies pushed beyond reasonable limits by the night's escape and the hours hiding in cold water. They slept in shifts, one watching while the other rested, though Jonah's watch periods were marked more by anxious vigilance than actual rest. Every sound in the swamp made him tense, ready to run again. But the day passed without incident. No dogs, no searchers, no signs that anyone knew where they'd gone. That evening, Jonah made a decision. They would follow the waterway north for several days, staying in wild country, avoiding settlements and roads. Once they were far enough from the plantation region, they would angle eastward toward the Mississippi River proper. There were stories about free black communities along certain stretches of the river, places where a fugitive might find help or at least not be immediately turned in for reward money. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. The journey that followed was a blur of hardship and constant fear. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in whatever shelter they could find. They ate their dwindling supplies sparingly, supplementing with fish they caught by hand and roots. Ruth identified as edible from her knowledge of plants. They avoided all human contact, sometimes hiding for hours when they heard voices or saw signs of recent habitation. On the fifth night, they encountered their first real crisis since the initial escape. While moving along what they thought was an empty stretch of shoreline, they stumbled into a camp of men, rough-looking whites, who were clearly surprised to see two black people emerge from the darkness. The men reached for weapons immediately, and Jonah knew they were slave catchers, or worse. He and Ruth ran, crashing back into the underbrush without regard for noise or direction. Shots were fired, bullets whistling past them in the darkness, and Jonah felt one tug at his sleeve without penetrating flesh. They ran until they couldn't hear pursuit anymore, then kept running because terror drove them forward. When they finally stopped, they had no idea where they were. No sense of direction or position. They'd lost their supplies in the flight, left behind the small pack that contained their remaining food and the few tools Jonah had managed to steal. The setback was devastating. Without supplies, without clear direction, their chances of survival dropped precipitously. Ruth cried quietly while Jonah held her, neither of them speaking the fears that crowded their minds. They could turn back, try to surrender, hope for mercy, though mercy from masters toward runaways was rare and usually involved punishment, severe enough to serve as example to others. Or they could keep going forward into unknown territory with no food and no plan beyond simple survival. Jonah chose forward. He always chose forward. Backward was death of a different kind, and he'd rather die trying to reach freedom than live as a cautionary tale for other enslaved people who might dream of escape. They traveled for 2 more days on nothing but water and the occasional handful of berries. Ruth grew weak, stumbling often, her face drawn and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Jonah wasn't much better. His feet were torn and bleeding from the rough terrain. His clothes hung on him in rags. He'd lost his hat days ago, and the sun had burned his face and neck raw. On the afternoon of the 7th day after their escape, they emerged from swampland onto solid ground for the first time in what felt like forever. Before them stretched cultivated fields, but these were different from the plantation lands they'd fled. The plots were smaller, the crops more varied. Small farmsteads dotted the landscape, none of them grand enough to suggest plantation ownership. Jonah studied the area carefully. This looked like yeoman farmer country, poor whites working their own land with perhaps 1 or 2 enslaved people, if they owned any at all. It was risky to approach anyone, but they were out of options. Without food and help, they would die out here in the wilderness, and their deaths would serve no purpose. He spotted a small farmhouse set back from a dirt road, smoke rising from its chimney. The place looked modest but well-maintained. No dogs visible in the yard, which was a good sign. Jonah made Ruth wait in the tree line while he approached cautiously, ready to run if the situation turned hostile. An older woman was working in a garden beside the house, her hands deep in the soil, her gray hair tucked under a faded bonnet. She looked up when Jonah approached, her eyes widening in surprise but not, he noted, in fear or anger. She straightened slowly, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're running," she said. It wasn't a question. Jonah considered lying, decided against it. "Yes, ma'am. My wife is with me, in the trees there. We need help. Food if you can spare it. Information about where we are, and how to get north." The woman looked past him toward the tree line where Ruth was hiding, then back at Jonah's face. She was quiet for a long moment, and Jonah prepared himself for the rejection he expected. Instead, she gestured toward the house. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. Quickly before anyone sees you on my road." Inside the small farmhouse, the woman fed them bread and stew while her husband, a thin, silent man with weathered skin, watched from a rocking chair in the corner. They ate like starving animals, which they essentially were. The woman didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. When they'd finished eating, she gave them information. "You're 30 miles north of where you started," she said. "This is Yazoo County still, but barely. You keep heading north, and you'll reach Tennessee territory within a week on foot. From there, you got better chances. There's Quaker communities up that way, some of them willing to help people in your situation, but you can't use the main roads. Patrollers are everywhere, especially this close to cotton harvest time when runaways are common." She provided them with better supplies than they'd lost, food that would last a week if they were careful, a blanket, matches for fire, Her husband remained silent throughout, but when they were leaving, he pressed a small knife into Jonah's hand, their eyes meeting briefly in understanding that no words could improve upon. "God go with you," the woman said at the door. "I don't reckon I'll see you again, but I hope you make it. I truly do." Jonah and Ruth left that farmhouse with renewed hope and energy. The kindness of strangers, when it came, was like water in a desert. They pushed north through the remainder of Yazoo County, moving faster now with solid food in their bellies and decent supplies on their backs. The terrain gradually changed, becoming more hilly, less dominated by swampland. 10 days after their escape, they crossed into what Jonah believed was Tennessee. Guided by landmarks the farm woman had described, they were moving through forests now, following game trails and small streams, avoiding all signs of human habitation. Ruth's spirits had improved considerably since receiving help from the farm couple. She sang sometimes as they walked, old songs from childhood, her voice soft but clear in the forest silence. Then, on the 13th night, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. They'd made camp in a small cave, a dry space barely large enough for 2 people to lie down in. A cold rain had started falling at dusk, and they'd congratulated themselves on finding shelter before the weather turned truly miserable. Jonah built a small fire at the cave mouth, just enough to provide warmth without sending up obvious smoke signals. In the middle of the night, he woke to Ruth's hand, shaking his shoulder urgently. Her face was twisted with pain, one hand pressed to her side. "Something's wrong," she gasped. "Jonah, something's really wrong." She'd been feeling poorly for the last day or two, had mentioned stomach pains, but dismissed them as effects of their irregular diet and constant stress. But this was different. This was acute and serious. Jonah helped her lie back down, felt her forehead, and found it burning with fever. When he examined her side where she indicated pain, he found the skin hot and swollen. He wasn't a doctor, had no medical training beyond basic field remedy knowledge, but he'd seen enough sickness in the slave quarters to recognize the danger signs. This was some kind of internal problem, infection or organ damage, or something equally serious. Ruth needed proper medical care, needed it immediately, and they were in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but forest and rain and darkness surrounding them. The next morning, Ruth was worse. The fever had climbed higher, and she was becoming delirious, muttering words that made no sense, her eyes unfocused and rolling. Jonah held her while the rain continued to fall, feeling helpless and terrified in equal measure. They'd come so far, survived so much, and now this, random biology, random bad luck, threatening to end everything. He made a decision he knew was dangerous but unavoidable. He would have to seek help from the nearest settlement. He would have to risk capture or betrayal, because the alternative was watching Ruth die in this cave from an illness he couldn't treat. He wrapped her in the blanket to keep her as warm as possible, then left her in the cave while he went to search for help. He found a small settlement within an hour's walk, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a few houses. Jonah approached cautiously, staying hidden in the tree line, trying to determine if this was the kind of place that would help or harm them. While he watched, a man emerged from one of the buildings, a black man, free by his dress and bearing, walking with the casual confidence of someone who had no fear of patrollers or slave catchers. Jonah made a decision based on instinct and desperation. He stepped out from cover and approached the man directly. The man saw him coming, took in his appearance, his ragged clothes and desperate expression, and his face went carefully neutral. "I need help," Jonah said without preamble. "My wife is sick, real sick, fever and pain. She's in a cave about an hour from here. I need someone who knows medicine and can keep quiet about where we came from." The man studied Jonah for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Follow me," he said, "and stay close. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't look at anyone directly. Just stay with me and walk like you belong here." The man led Jonah to a modest house on the settlement's edge. Inside, a woman looked up from her cooking, saw Jonah, and immediately understood without needing explanation. These were free blacks who'd clearly helped runaways before, who knew the signs and the risks and chose to help anyway. The woman, who introduced herself only as Sarah, gathered medical supplies into a basket and followed Jonah back to the cave where Ruth lay. She examined Ruth efficiently, asked questions about symptoms and duration, then began treating the illness with herbs and poultices Jonah didn't recognize. She worked with calm competence, and Jonah felt some of his panic ease just from watching her methodical care. "Infection," Sarah said after an hour's work, "started in her gut, probably from bad water or spoiled food. It's serious but not beyond help if we can get the fever down and the infection cleared. She needs rest and proper care for at least a week, maybe 2. We can't stay anywhere that long," Jonah said. "The search," Sarah shook her head firmly. "You don't have a choice. She moves now in this condition. She dies. Simple as that. You want her to live, you stay put, and let me tend her." So they stayed. Sarah and her husband, whose name was Malcolm, brought food and medicine daily. They shared information about safe routes north. Once Ruth was well enough to travel, they asked for nothing in return except that Jonah and Ruth survive and remember to help others when they could. It was a mercy that seemed almost impossible in a world built on cruelty and ownership. But there it was, offered freely from people who had little themselves but gave anyway. Ruth recovered slowly over the course of 2 weeks. The fever broke on the 4th day, and after that, it was a matter of rebuilding her strength and waiting for the infection to fully clear. Jonah spent the time hunting small game to supplement their supplies and studying the maps and information Malcolm provided about routes north through Tennessee and into Kentucky. When Ruth was finally strong enough to travel again, they said goodbye to Sarah and Malcolm with genuine tears on all sides. These people had saved Ruth's life at great risk to themselves, and there was no way to adequately thank them or repay the debt. "Go north," Malcolm said at their parting. "Cross into Kentucky and head for Louisville. There's a settlement of free blacks there, and white folks who'll help. You get to Louisville, you're most of the way to real freedom. Just keep moving, and trust that not everyone in this world is cruel." They traveled for another 3 weeks through Tennessee and into Kentucky, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day, living off the land and the occasional kindness of strangers who recognized them for what they were and chose not to betray them. The journey wore on them physically and mentally. There were close calls with patrollers, nights when they heard dogs in the distance and had to hide in impossible places until the danger passed. There were days when they questioned whether they would survive, whether freedom was real, or just a story people told each other to make slavery more bearable. But they kept moving north, through forests and farmland, across rivers and over hills, past settlements that looked safe, and ones that definitely weren't. Ruth grew stronger with each passing day, her natural resilience reasserting itself. Jonah navigated by stars and instinct and the careful directions provided by the few people brave enough to help them along the way. 6 weeks after leaving Mississippi, they reached Louisville. The city was larger than any place Jonah had ever seen. Buildings rising 3 and 4 stories, streets filled with more people than he'd thought existed in the entire world. They entered cautiously, following the directions Malcolm had provided, looking for specific landmarks that would lead them to the free black settlement. They found it in a neighborhood on the city's northern edge, a cluster of modest but well-maintained homes where black families lived and worked without the immediate threat of enslavement. It was like entering another world. Jonah stood on a street corner and watched black children play without fear, watched black men walk freely without looking over their shoulders, watched black women shop in markets and laugh with each other and exist as fully human in a way he'd never witnessed before. An older man approached them, taking in their road-worn appearance and the wonder on their faces. "You just arrive?" he asked kindly. "Yes, sir," Jonah said. "From Mississippi. We've been traveling for near 2 months." The man smiled, lines crinkling around his eyes. "Well then, welcome to Louisville. Welcome to the beginning of your new life. Come on, let's get you settled. You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sleep." That evening, sitting in a small house provided by the free black community, eating food they didn't have to steal or scavenge, Ruth turned to Jonah with tears streaming down her face. "We made it," she said, her voice breaking. "We actually made it." Jonah pulled her close, feeling his own tears come. They'd traveled over 300 miles through hostile territory. They'd nearly died a dozen times over. They'd been hunted, shot at, starved, and exhausted beyond human limits. But they'd survived. They'd made it to a place where they could begin to imagine a future that included choice and possibility. News of their escape reached back to Mississippi slowly, carried by travelers and traders, and the strange informal network of communication that existed among enslaved people throughout the South. The story grew in the telling, accumulating details and embellishments until it became something more than a simple account of 2 people running away. It became a legend, a ghost story, a tale that white plantation owners told each other with uneasy laughter while their enslaved workers listened silently and remembered. The key element that captured everyone's imagination was the gate, that livestock gate on the western edge of the Hartwell plantation, the one Jonah had left standing open that September evening. According to multiple witnesses, the gate had begun swinging by itself shortly after Jonah's disappearance was discovered. Despite the air being perfectly still, the gate moved on its hinges, with enough force to make the metal creak and groan. When men tried to close it, they found they couldn't. Their hands would slip, or the wood would seem to move under their grip, or they would suddenly lose the strength needed to move the heavy oak plank. For 3 days and 3 nights, the gate swung open and closed, the hinges screaming like tortured metal, until finally it fell silent and still on its own. Some said they could hear it calling Jonah's name, though that was probably imagination added to real events. but multiple reliable witnesses confirmed the gate's impossible movement, and no one could explain it by natural means. Master Hartwell had the gate removed and burned after it finally stopped moving. The posts were pulled up and new ones sunk in different locations, but the story persisted, grew, became part of the local mythology. Enslaved people on surrounding plantations heard about Jonah, who'd walked away through a gate that wouldn't close behind him, who'd disappeared into the swamp and never been caught, who'd somehow made it to freedom despite everything that should have stopped him. The story spread. It reached slaves in Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas. It reached free blacks in northern cities, who added it to their repertoire of resistance tales. It was told in quarters and workfields and secret gatherings, always in whispers, always with the understanding that it meant something important, even if no one could quite articulate what. In Mississippi, the Hartwell plantation continued operating for years afterward, though Master Hartwell developed a reputation as an unlucky man after Jonah's escape. 3 more of his slaves ran away over the next 5 years, an unusually high number that suggested something about Jonah's successful flight had damaged the psychological control that kept most enslaved people from attempting escape. The Henderson plantation sold Ruth at auction, of course, not knowing she'd already escaped. The buyer was a sugar planter who arrived to collect his purchase and found nothing but an empty space where his property should have been. Jonah and Ruth built a life in Louisville that was ordinary in all the ways that mattered and extraordinary in the context of what they'd survived to reach it. Jonah found work at a stable, then later at a freight company. Ruth took in sewing and eventually opened a small shop making dresses for Louisville's growing black middle class. They had 3 children, none of whom would ever know slavery firsthand, though they would grow up hearing their parents' stories and understanding the price of the freedom they enjoyed. Years later, in 1862, when war finally came and Union armies pushed into the South with the power to end slavery by force, Jonah stood on a Louisville street corner reading newspaper accounts of battles in Mississippi. He was 46 years old, gray beginning to show in his hair, his hands marked by honest work rather than forced labor. Ruth stood beside him, her hand in his, both of them trying to comprehend that the system that had once owned them was now collapsing under its own weight and the pressure of northern armies. The war brought refugees north, enslaved people who'd fled advancing battle lines, who'd walked away from plantations when their masters evacuated or when Union troops appeared. Jonah and Ruth helped when they could, providing food and shelter and advice to people attempting the same journey they'd made nearly 20 years earlier. Each person who arrived safely felt like a small victory, a crack in the system that had claimed to own human souls. In 1865, the war ended, and slavery with it. Jonah received the news while working at the freight office, a co-worker bringing in the newspaper with the proclamation and the treaty terms. He'd read it 3 times before he fully believed it, before he accepted that the thing he'd fled from no longer legally existed, that the children and grandchildren being born now would never experience what he'd survived. That evening, he and Ruth walked through Louisville's streets as they often did, just enjoying the simple freedom to go where they wished when they wished. But this evening felt different, weighted with a historical significance they couldn't quite articulate. Something fundamental had changed in the American landscape, and they'd lived to see it. "We should go back," Ruth said suddenly. "Not to stay, but to see, to know it's really gone." So they did. In the autumn of 1866, they traveled south through a landscape transformed by war and emancipation. The plantations still stood but were different now, worked by free labor or abandoned to weeds. The roads were filled with formerly enslaved people testing their new freedom, walking just to prove they could, going places just because no one could stop them anymore. They found the Hartwell plantation easily enough, though the place looked smaller than Jonah remembered, less imposing without the psychological weight of enslavement pressing down on his perception. The big house was still there but showed signs of neglect. The fields were partially cultivated, but nothing like the extensive cotton operation of the past. Master Hartwell himself was gone, dead during the war years, his sons scattered, and his property divided. Jonah walked to where the livestock gate had stood, the gate he'd left swinging open on that September night so long ago. New gates had been built and removed several times over the years, but the location was the same. He stood there with Ruth beside him, looking west toward the swamp country that had hidden them during their flight. "Do you think it really moved on its own?" Ruth asked. "The gate, or was that just a story people told?" Jonah considered the question. He'd heard the various versions of the tale over the years, the legend that had grown from their escape. Some versions claimed the gate had a mind of its own. Others said it was haunted by the spirits of all the enslaved people who'd never made it to freedom. Still others suggested it was a sign from God that justice would eventually come. "I think," Jonah said slowly, "that sometimes people need symbols to make sense of things they can't quite express in words. I left that gate open because I was done with it. Done with boundaries set by other people. Done with being fenced in. Maybe it kept moving because other people saw what I'd done and wanted to believe they could do the same. Maybe it was just wind and timing and coincidence. But what matters is what people made of it, the hope it represented." They stayed in Mississippi for a week, meeting with formerly enslaved people who remembered Jonah's escape, who'd heard the stories, and wanted to meet the man who'd become a legend. He was uncomfortable with the attention but understood its importance. People needed heroes, needed proof that resistance was possible, and sometimes even successful. On their last day, they visited the graves of Jonah's mother and the other people he'd known in bondage, who hadn't lived to see freedom. He stood before those simple markers and told them what had happened, how the world had changed, how their suffering hadn't been meaningless, even though it had been unjust. Then he and Ruth traveled back to Louisville, back to their ordinary, extraordinary life, back to the world they'd made through courage and luck and the kindness of strangers. The story of the gate that wouldn't close, the slave who walked away and never came back, became part of Mississippi folklore, told and retold, changing with each telling but always carrying the core truth at its center. A man had been enslaved. He'd decided not to be enslaved anymore. He'd walked through a gate and left it swinging behind him. And somehow, impossibly, he'd survived the journey to freedom. The gate became a symbol of boundaries that could be crossed, of control that could be rejected, of systems that seemed permanent but were actually vulnerable to individual acts of courage. In later years, historians and folklorists would study the story, trying to separate fact from fiction, trying to understand what really happened on the Hartwell plantation in September of 1844. They'd interview descendants of enslaved people who'd lived on surrounding plantations, collect different versions of the tale, analyze it for historical accuracy and cultural significance. But for Jonah, sitting in his Louisville home in his old age, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd never known the terror of enslavement. The gate was simply the marker of a boundary crossed. On one side had been the life he'd been born into, constrained and controlled, his body and labor owned by another man. On the other side was the life he'd claimed for himself, uncertain and dangerous but his own. The gate had swung open because he'd pushed it. It had stayed open because he'd walked through it and never looked back. Whether it moved by wind or will or the weight of accumulated injustice didn't matter nearly as much as what it represented, a passage from one life to another, from bondage to freedom, from being property to being human. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered. Not the details of hinges and gates and impossible movements, but the simple truth that a man who'd been told he had no right to freedom had taken it anyway, had walked through an open gate into the unknown and survived to build a life on the other side. The gate was long gone, rotted away or burned or simply collapsed under the weight of years. But the story remained, passed down through generations, a reminder that boundaries drawn by injustice are always vulnerable to people brave enough to cross them, and that sometimes the impossible happens when ordinary people refuse to accept the limits placed on their lives. Their first child was born in Louisville in the spring of 1846, a daughter they named Celia, after Jonah's mother. Holding that infant in his arms for the first time, Jonah experienced an emotion so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees. This child would never be owned. No one could sell her away from him. No master could decide her fate, or claim her labor, or determine who she could love. The weight of that freedom, that simple reality that should have been every parent's birthright, overwhelmed him completely. Ruth watched him hold their daughter with tears streaming down her face, understanding exactly what he was feeling because she felt it too. They'd done more than escape slavery for themselves. They'd broken a chain that had been forged across generations, had ensured that their children would start life with possibilities their parents could never have imagined. Celia grew up hearing stories about the journey her parents had made. Though Jonah and Ruth were careful about how much detail they shared when she was young, they wanted her to understand where she came from, to appreciate the cost of her freedom. But they didn't want to burden her childhood with nightmares about slave catchers and bloodhounds. There would be time enough for the full truth when she was older. The Louisville Free Black community embraced the growing family, providing support and friendship that helped ease the lingering trauma of their escape. Jonah found himself part of a network of formerly enslaved people and those who'd been born free, all working together to build stable lives in a world that still viewed them with suspicion and hostility despite their legal freedom. Kentucky was a border state, neither fully northern nor southern in its sympathies, and black residents had to navigate complex social and legal restrictions even as they built their community. In 1848, their second child was born, a son they named Marcus. 2 years later came another daughter, Leah. The small house Jonah had rented when they first arrived in Louisville became too cramped for a family of 5, so he saved money carefully and eventually purchased a modest property on the edge of the black neighborhood. It was the first thing he'd ever truly owned, that house and the small plot of land it sat on, and signing the deed felt almost as momentous as crossing into free territory had felt years earlier. The children grew. Celia proved to have her mother's talent with needle and thread, spending hours in Ruth's shop learning the trade. Marcus was more like his father, quiet and observant, with a gift for understanding how things worked mechanically. Leah was the bold one, unafraid of anything, her personality shaped by growing up free in ways her parents never had been. She would march up to white children in the market and announce they should play together. Oblivious to the social barriers her parents navigated carefully every day, Jonah worked steadily at the freight company, proving himself reliable and skilled until he was promoted to a supervisory position, managing a team of workers and overseeing shipments. It was unusual for a black man to hold such a role, even in Louisville. But the company owner was a progressive Quaker who believed in judging men by their abilities rather than their race. The position paid well enough that Ruth could reduce her sewing hours and spend more time with the children, though she never stopped working entirely. She'd learned too well the value of independence to give it up completely. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Jonah and Ruth would sit together on their small porch and talk about the future. They discussed education for the children, debated whether to stay in Louisville or move further north where racial restrictions were less severe, planned for contingencies and possibilities. These conversations were a luxury they'd never imagined having back in Mississippi. The simple ability to make choices about their own lives and their children's futures. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 cast a shadow over their relative security. The new law required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners and imposed penalties on anyone who helped fugitives. Suddenly, even free black people in free states weren't entirely safe. Slave catchers could claim almost anyone as a runaway, and the burden of proof fell on the accused to demonstrate their free status. Without proper documentation, which many formerly enslaved people lacked, anyone could be kidnapped into slavery. Jonah and Ruth purchased freedom papers from a sympathetic lawyer, documents that falsely claimed they'd been manumitted by their former masters rather than escaped. It was expensive and technically fraudulent, but necessary for their safety. They kept those papers hidden carefully, knowing they might mean the difference between freedom and capture if slave catchers ever came north looking for them. The fear was not abstract. Several people in Louisville's black community were kidnapped during the 1850s, claimed as runaways, whether they actually were or not, taken south in chains to lives of bondage. Each disappearance sent waves of terror through the neighborhood. Jonah started sleeping with a knife under his pillow and made plans for how the family could scatter and hide if raiders came for them. He taught the children routes through the city, places they could go for help, people they could trust. It was a grim education, but a necessary one. Despite these fears, life continued. The children attended a school run by the black church, learning reading and mathematics and history from teachers who understood the importance of education for formerly enslaved people and their descendants. Celia excelled academically, showing particular aptitude for literature and writing. Marcus was more practical-minded but equally intelligent, preferring to learn through doing rather than reading. Leah absorbed everything thrown at her with the confidence of a child who'd never been told she couldn't learn or achieve or become whatever she wanted. In 1854, Ruth's shop expanded into a larger space, allowing her to hire 2 assistants and take on more complex sewing projects. She developed a reputation for excellent work and fair prices, attracting customers from across Louisville's black community and even some progressive white families who didn't mind supporting a black-owned business. The additional income meant the family could save more, could think about larger goals like property ownership or business expansion. Jonah, meanwhile, had become something of a community leader, despite his quiet nature. His story was known throughout Louisville's black neighborhoods, and people came to him for advice about escape routes for relatives still enslaved in the South, about legal matters, about how to navigate the complex world of free black life in a slave state. He was reluctant to claim any special wisdom, but he couldn't turn away people who needed help, so he did what he could. He also began working more formally with the Underground Railroad network, using his position at the freight company to hide fugitives in shipments heading north, providing safe houses for people passing through Louisville on their way to Canada. It was dangerous work that could get him imprisoned or killed, but Jonah felt a responsibility to help others make the journey he'd made. He and Ruth both understood that their freedom carried an obligation to assist those still seeking it. Over the years, they helped dozens of people escape to freedom, joining the free black community there. Others continued north to Ohio or Michigan, or across the border into Canada, where they were completely beyond the reach of slave law. Each successful passage felt like a small victory against the system that had once claimed to own them. The children grew into adolescence understanding that their home was part of a resistance network, that the people who sometimes appeared in their house for a night or two before disappearing were fugitives seeking freedom. Celia began helping her mother provide clothes and food for the travelers. Marcus learned to keep watch and signal if anyone suspicious approached their property. Even Leah, the youngest, understood the importance of silence about what happened in their home. In 1857, when Celia was 11 years old, a young woman arrived at their door late one night, pregnant and terrified, having run from a plantation in Tennessee. Her name was Hannah, and she was perhaps 19 years old. Though hardship made her look older, she'd escaped because her master intended to sell her unborn child as soon as it was weaned, and she'd decided she would rather die trying to reach freedom than watch her baby be taken from her. Ruth took Hannah in immediately, recognizing in the young woman's desperation an echo of her own past. Hannah stayed with the family for 3 weeks, while arrangements were made for her to travel further north. During that time, she went into labor, delivering a healthy son in the bedroom that Celia and Leah shared. The girls banished to the front room while their mother and a midwife friend worked through the long, difficult night of birth. When Hannah left with her newborn son, heading for a Quaker settlement in Indiana that had agreed to take her in, she embraced Ruth and Jonah with fierce gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved both of us. I won't forget. I'll tell my son about you when he's old enough to understand." Jonah watched her disappear into the darkness, with her baby wrapped against her chest. And he thought about that livestock gate swinging open on Hartwell's plantation, about boundaries crossed and chains broken, about how one act of courage could ripple outward in ways you never anticipated. The late 1850s brought increasing tension to the entire nation. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated political discourse. Violence erupted in Kansas between pro-slavery and abolitionist settlers. The Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that black people had no rights. White people were bound to respect, that even free blacks weren't truly citizens. The decision was a devastating blow to the black community in Louisville and everywhere else. A legal confirmation of what many had already felt, that their freedom was conditional and fragile. Jonah attended community meetings where black leaders debated how to respond to the mounting hostility. Some argued for emigration to Canada or Africa, believing that true equality would never be possible in America. Others insisted on staying and fighting for their rights as residents, if not citizens. The debates were passionate and sometimes bitter, everyone understanding that enormous consequences hung on these decisions. Through it all, Jonah and Ruth kept their family functioning, kept their businesses operating, kept helping fugitives pass through Louisville toward safer territories. They'd survived too much to give up now, had invested too much in building a life to abandon it based on judicial opinions or political developments. They would stay and endure and help others do the same. When John Brown raided the arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859, attempting to start a slave rebellion, the news electrified Louisville's black community. Brown's execution was mourned as the death of a righteous man who died fighting slavery while most people merely talked about it. Jonah understood the sentiment, but also recognized that Brown's methods, however righteous in intent, had likely made life more dangerous for free blacks and enslaved people alike by confirming Southern fears of Northern insurrection. The presidential election of 1860 fractured the nation along sectional lines. When Abraham Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state, the secession crisis began almost immediately. South Carolina left the Union in December. Other states followed through the winter and spring. By April of 1861, Confederate forces were firing on Fort Sumter, and the war everyone had dreaded but many had expected was finally underway. Kentucky tried to remain neutral at first, declaring it would support neither the Union nor the Confederacy. This suited neither side, and both worked to pull the state into their orbit. Louisville, with its river port and railroad connections, was strategically vital. Union forces eventually occupied the city, and Kentucky remained in the Union, though deeply divided in its loyalties. For Louisville's black community, the war brought both hope and danger. Hope that it might finally end slavery. Danger that Confederate sympathizers in Kentucky might take vengeance on black residents they blamed for the conflict. There were attacks, property destroyed, people beaten or killed in racial violence that the occupied Union forces couldn't entirely prevent. Jonah armed himself and organized neighborhood watches, men taking turns patrolling the black districts at night to warn of approaching mobs. Marcus, who'd turned 15 in 1860, wanted to enlist in the Union Army. Many young black men were eager to fight, seeing it as both a chance to prove their worth as citizens and to strike directly at the system of slavery. But the army wasn't accepting black soldiers at the start of the war, and Jonah was quietly relieved. He understood Marcus's desire to contribute but couldn't bear the thought of losing his son to battlefield violence. The war ground on through 1862 and into 1863. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, technically freeing enslaved people in rebel states, though not in border states like Kentucky that remained in the Union. The proclamation's limitations frustrated many but still represented a fundamental shift in the war's purpose, transforming it from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight to end slavery. Black soldiers were finally allowed to enlist in 1863. Marcus joined immediately, despite his parents' concerns, signing up with the 5th United States Colored Troops Regiment being formed in Ohio. Jonah and Ruth saw him off at the train station, both of them struggling to maintain composure, while their son, barely 16 despite claiming to be 18 on his enlistment papers, headed off to war. Celia, now 17, had taken over much of Ruth's sewing business, while her mother spent more time organizing support for black soldiers and their families. She'd developed into a skilled seamstress and a shrewd businesswoman, expanding the shop's operations and employing several other young women from the community. She'd also attracted the attention of a young school teacher named David Freeman, a freeborn black man from Ohio who'd come to Louisville to work in the freedmen's schools that were beginning to open. Leah, 14, and as bold as ever, had taken to writing. She kept detailed journals of life during the war years, capturing the fears and hopes and daily struggles of the black community in Louisville. She talked about becoming a journalist someday, about telling the stories of formerly enslaved people to audiences who needed to understand what slavery had really been like. Her parents encouraged her ambitions even as they worried about how the world would treat a black woman with such aspirations. Marcus survived the war, though barely. He was wounded twice, once at the Battle of Newmarket Heights in Virginia, and again during the final siege of Petersburg. The wounds left him with a permanent limp and occasional pain, but he considered himself lucky. Many of his fellow soldiers from the 5th hadn't made it home at all. He'd seen enough death to last several lifetimes, had watched friends and brothers in arms fall to bullets and disease and the 1,000 other ways war found to kill young men. When he returned to Louisville in the summer of 1865, Marcus was 20 years old, but looked and acted much older. The boy who'd left eager to prove himself had been replaced by a man who'd seen too much and understood too well the cost of freedom. Jonah recognized the change immediately, saw in his son's eyes something of what he'd felt during his own desperate flight from slavery, that knowledge of how close death had come and how arbitrary survival could be. The end of the war brought celebration to the black community, but also uncertainty about what came next. Slavery was legally abolished throughout the nation by the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865. 4 million formerly enslaved people were suddenly free, most of them with no resources, no education, no clear path forward. The magnitude of that transition was staggering, and everyone understood that freedom alone wouldn't guarantee equality or prosperity. Jonah was nearly 50 years old now, his hair gone mostly gray, his body showing the accumulated effects of hard labor and constant stress. But the knowledge that slavery was truly ended, that no child would be born into bondage anymore in the United States, energized him in ways he hadn't expected. He threw himself into community work, helping newly freed people arriving in Louisville from rural areas find housing and employment, teaching literacy classes at the Freedmen's School, serving on committees that advocated for black civil rights. Ruth's health had begun to decline, the years of stress and hard work taking their toll. She suffered from recurring respiratory problems that left her weak and short of breath. Celia took over running the sewing business almost entirely, allowing her mother to rest more, though Ruth chafed at being inactive. She'd spent so much of her life working toward freedom and security that she didn't know quite what to do with herself when forced into idleness. In 1866, Celia married David Freeman in a ceremony at the Black Church, the first wedding in the family where everyone present was legally free. It was a joyous occasion despite Ruth's obvious fatigue, a celebration of not just two people joining their lives, but of possibilities that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. David and Celia could legally marry, could own property together, could build a life without fear that someone would sell one of them away from the other. They settled in Louisville, David continuing his teaching work while Celia ran the sewing business. Within a year, they had a daughter, the first of Jonah and Ruth's grandchildren. Holding that baby girl, Jonah marveled at how far his family had traveled in just over 20 years. From enslaved people running through swamps to avoid capture, to grandparents holding a free-born grandchild in a home they owned in a city where they could vote and testify in court and exercise at least some of the rights of citizenship. The journey from Mississippi had produced this moment. This child who would grow up in a fundamentally different world than the one her grandparents had known. She would face racism and discrimination and the legacy of slavery that would persist for generations. But she would face it as a citizen, as a person with legal standing and protections, as someone who could dream of futures her ancestors couldn't have imagined. Marcus never fully recovered from his war wounds, the pain in his leg limiting what work he could do. But he found purpose in helping other black veterans navigate the bureaucracy of pension claims and benefits. He married a young woman named Sarah who'd escaped from a plantation in Georgia during the war, and they built a life together, despite the challenges of his physical limitations and her ongoing trauma from her experiences in slavery. Leah became the writer she'd always wanted to be, though not in ways she'd initially imagined. She wrote for black newspapers and religious publications, documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people, arguing for civil rights and equal treatment, keeping alive the stories of resistance and survival that might otherwise be forgotten. Her work was passionate and eloquent, and she developed a following among readers who appreciated her refusal to soften the harsh realities of what slavery had been. Through all these changes, the story of Jonah's escape continued to circulate, passed down through generations, modified and embellished but always retaining its essential truth. People told the tale of the gate that wouldn't close, the slave who walked away and never came back, the impossible journey that ended in freedom. It became part of the collective memory of Black Louisville, a reminder that resistance had always been possible, even when it seemed futile. Jonah lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family, a free man in a changed world. Ruth had passed 2 years earlier, her respiratory problems finally overwhelming her body's ability to recover. Jonah had mourned her deeply, missing the woman who'd been his partner in the most dangerous and important journey of his life. They'd built something remarkable together, a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. His last words, Ruth would later tell their children, were about that September evening when he'd walked away from the life that had been forced upon him. "I left the gate open," he'd murmured, his voice weak but clear. "I left it open so others could follow." And they did. They did. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from Louisville's black community and beyond, people whose lives he'd touched through his quiet leadership and steady example. They buried him beside Ruth in the black section of the Louisville cemetery, beneath a simple stone that identified him as a husband, father, and friend. The inscription made no mention of his escape from slavery or the legend of the swinging gate, but everyone who attended the funeral knew those stories and understood what his life had represented. In the years after Jonah's death, his children and grandchildren continued the work he'd begun. They taught in schools, ran businesses, organized for civil rights, helped newly freed people adapt to their changed circumstances. They passed down his story to their children, making sure each generation understood where they'd come from and what price had been paid for the freedoms they enjoyed. The tale of the gate that wouldn't stop swinging became a family legend, a touchstone connecting them to their history and reminding them that seemingly impossible things could be achieved through courage and determination. And somewhere in Mississippi, in the rich black soil of the Delta, the space where that gate once stood remained marked only by memory and the stories people told about what had happened there on a still September evening in 1844. The plantation had long since been subdivided and sold, the big house fallen into ruin, the cotton fields reclaimed by forest and swamp, but the legend persisted, outlasting the physical reality of the place, becoming something larger and more meaningful than any gate or plantation or system of bondage could ever be. It became a story about freedom and the human refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, a reminder that every system of oppression contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, planted by people brave enough to say no, to walk away, to leave the gate swinging open behind them for others to follow through.